inability to fit our doings into nature's patterns is what has caused this problem. So that I want to look at what are the habits that we have, what are the customs that lead to our damaging doings. To do that, I've long ago, over those decades, made a list that compares human activities to nature's activities. I had no intention initially that we would actually use that to guide us, but we just used it to understand. But it turns out, as I hope I can persuade you, that also that list provides a guidance. So I made a table, and this is the latest version of it. It's slowly grown. It's constantly in, like life, it's constantly developing and changing. But of natural processes on the left side and of human industrial activities. I don't mean all human activities, I mean the last 200 years, and especially the last 50, since indeed limits to growth and all that happened, we've done a lot worse and we should have done a lot better. So here is the list, which I can just go through quickly, but you'll see it's fairly obvious. I'm going to follow this in a moment by going through each level separately. But we all know the first one, we use fossil fuel, the whole of nature uses the sun. We work cyclically, we work linearly, nature works in cycles, and therefore the third one follows that we turn resources into waste. When nature, there is no waste. And then the fourth one is often misunderstood. I'll describe that more, where nature works by Adam Smith's micro competition. We tend to override all natural systems. I'll describe that more. That leads to us producing large excesses. It's now changing slides, and us producing large excesses, whereas nature never does, surprisingly to most people. And in the course of that, we decrease diversity and complexity, and we get into trouble, whereas nature does the opposite. And we thereby have global impacts, whereas nature works locally. And we drive global change, whereas nature makes for global stability. So all those things add up to the last one, number 9. Nature works with its own feedback controls, and they are mostly negative. We have little feedback control on our activities, and they are mostly positive. So I'll go through each of those 9 differences and discuss them a little bit more, and then discuss the possible solutions and where we stand. So here is number 1, powered by the sun, we are powered by fossil fuel. It's just worth reflecting. The use of fire is what makes us human. It allows us to cook, it protects us, it warms us, and so on. Fire has become so fundamental. It was harnessed, I calculated, perhaps 40,000 generations ago, 1 million years, maybe 2 million. I don't know that archaeologists know exactly. But it's a sufficient number of generations that one could imagine that the use of fire is now genetically assimilated, what Waddington called genetic assimilation. It's a stage of evolution that we've chosen to forget, but a method of evolution that is nevertheless, I think, very real. I'll come back to that in a moment. So fire is fundamental to our lives. And we'll talk about what happens in a minute. The green writing on the left, right throughout all this, is going to be solutions or probable solutions. I just need to take a little bit more on fire on the old bits. Entropy is a concept that is difficult for many people. Let's just think of it, though, as order. Low entropy is a high degree of order. High entropy is a low degree of order. And civilization, which we're on about, has always sought low entropy sources, where either there's a lot of fuel or a lot of grazing, life is highly organized, and they've exploited those. The classic example is Easter Island, and when exploited, they've either died out or they've moved on. Now we are, in the last 50 years, literally, we are in a position where we can completely change all that. The invention of the photovoltaic solar panel is a unique process, and it's the one example I can think of where there is a technical solution to our problems. All the others, whenever somebody comes up with a new technical wizardry, they make more problems. The photovoltaic panel seems to me to be the one big change. For the first time in 1 million years of evolution, we can turn the low entropy, high value sunlight directly into what we want, which is mainly motion, and of course warmth, even cooking. We can turn it directly into electricity, and that does anything for us. So we could, if we wanted, create a civilization that for the first time is without fire. It's something very difficult to imagine. We are so ingrained to using fire. There's another aspect to this, and we see that now with the Ukraine war very much. Suddenly, there's a spike rise in energy prices because we are so dependent on global energy supplies. Photovoltaic panels can go anywhere. We've got them on our house here. It is fantastic. And you are completely independent of anybody else if you wish to be. You're completely independent of outside energy, and you're completely insulated against cost rises and so on. It's a phenomenal solution. So number one is solvable. Now, number two, nature works in cycles, we all that. We work and think linearly. Science was started by Descartes and Francis Bacon, at least modern science, in the sense that they laid the basis of how you think about what science does. Both of them made it absolutely clear that knowledge itself, which is the meaning of science, in German Wissenschaft, the management of knowledge, science is powerful. Science gives us power over each other, power over nature, as we see every day. But I want to look at a more subtle issue here, which is more difficult to describe. And I put in the circular hen and egg question, which is first. And you can't answer that in a circular way. We have to split it in the way that Bacon and Descartes said we need to do science. Pick the detail and work on it. It's called reductionist science. And unless you split it into two, you can't give an answer. The egg becomes a hen and the hen lays an egg. Fine, but they're two separated questions. And that misunderstanding is now reflected in DNA and genetics and so on as being part of cell development, which it isn't. DNA is a participant in life. It is not the cause of anything. Genes don't cause anything. They are a piece of dead chemical and nothing more. And I compare it to literature. You can study literature all your life. It's all written down, doesn't make any difference, but you have to study it. Unless you do, there's no meaning to the literature. And my example, when I talk about this for genetically engineered crops, which are scientifically badly based for this reason, I suggest that in Shakespeare, you just have one little mutation. You change a T to a W, and what you get is to be or now to be. It is fantastic. the whole of Hamlet is changed by a single letter change from a tragedy to a tragicomedy. Hamlet at last, in now instead of not, would develop into a positive, optimistic being, and the whole play would be changed. So the effect of DNA and the mutation can be desperate, but it doesn't make it the cause of anything. Biology actually is circular in a very fundamental sense that is not easily understood. And it's an ecological sense, the result of lots of these circles, they all interlock. And so you come to what is Garrett Hardin's first principle of ecology: you can never do merely one thing. And nearly everything we try to do is doing merely one thing. And it's based on science. We see it now in the COVID vaccines. All the other treatments have been denigrated as useless, which is not the case, but that's how it is. You see it in agriculture as a whole. The whole of industrial agriculture was founded on a lack of understanding. Microbes, plant physiology, biochemistry, genetics, none of those things were dreamt about when Rothamsted Experimental Station started in 1843, 150 years ago. And it's all done on a narrow basis. So that is why we really have science as the basis, and I'll have more to say about that later. So if we can turn science, look at the green bit, into a circular thinking, we can use the very processes of science itself, that of being self-critical, that of looking at the issue as it is, but not dividing it into little pieces. And so we can change what it does to be circular. And of course, economy is designed to be linear, and farming can become agroecology, which is essentially circular. So that the cycles are vitally important. It's the habit of thinking linearly that I'm getting at. Mm. Now, and that takes us, of course, to waste. But again, we need to see a certain perspective. Nature does make waste, but not on a day-to-day basis. We assume that we can use any resource. The Resource Use Institute is based on using resources. What we mustn't do is use them once and throw them away. There is no away. But nature does have long-term deposits, which one, in our way of thinking, one could regard as waste. The elements calcium, carbon, and oxygen. They're deposited together as limestone. Carbon is deposited as coal and oil, and oxygen as the oxygen of the atmosphere. But it's worth noting that we now know for certain there was no oxygen when life started. Oxygen came in with the invention of photosynthesis, the photosynthesis that now drives the whole of life. Oxygen was a poison and still is. And people doubt that. They say, oh, but oxygen is absolutely vital for life. No, it is vital for our life, heterotrophic life that uses the products of photosynthesis to live. It is vital, but we have to keep it away from the important cells of our bodies, and hence the popularity of antioxidants. Everybody agrees we need antioxidants like vitamin C, but actually that's because oxygen remains a poison. So nature there has done a terrific thing, but over the course of 2 billion, 1,000 million years, an inconceivably long time. If you take the carbon from such a long time, most of the carbon is from 250 million years, not billion, 250 million years ago, was deposited then. If you put that suddenly, as we're doing in a few decades, back into the atmosphere, of course you have trouble. So the difference here is enormous. Nature works by cooperation, whereas we are proudest when we can override a natural system. We've done it on lots of things, but it's just worth reflecting on what it's all about. When Darwin published Evolution, it was in the time of Victorian imperialism, time of expansion of the Industrial Revolution into a way that had at its aim the domination of nature. And Darwin's idea that is caricatured by survival of the fittest, which is a word that Darwin never used. It was used by Spencer, I think, and then exaggerated by Tennyson, red in tooth and claw. I just ask you, who is the reddest of all? It's not nature, it's us. And we have distorted almost all hopes of doing what nature actually does, of being, so I don't know how to put this, of being a micro competitor and a macro cooperator. Adam Smith, who was after all a moral philosopher as much or more than an economist, his famous invisible hand is about micro competition in small markets where money replaced bartering so that you could have greater choice in what you got. But he did not envisage that that would turn into the mega corporations that we now have and that rule our world and dominate our impact on nature. And economics, therefore, has gone wrong in that sense completely. It's gone wrong in many other senses. We'll come back on that. I put here nature mutual aid is universal in quotes. Mutual aid, of course, was the first corrective of Darwin's interpretation, closer to Darwin than Spencer or Tennyson or most of the early followers of Darwin. Even now, because of the genetics that I've mentioned, what we call neo-Darwinism, which is to combine genetics with Darwin, has a fault in it, a fundamental anti-natural fault. And it is this one of competition and mutual aid and so on. It's a method by which evolution goes forward that is missing here. Now, there's lots of ways around this. Economics has founded circular economics, donut economics in one famous book. Agriculture can become cyclic. I've told you how science can. They can all become cooperative systems. The big one we need just now, not just because of Ukraine, which is the obvious one, but before that, because of climate change, is that the whole world needs to cooperate on getting things right. Otherwise, we're all in trouble together. And there's been a lot written in economics, even with Nobel Prizes to Elinor Outram, for instance, on how cooperation actually pays in a way that competition will not. And the essence here is that of democracy again, like in my first example with the solar panels. If you have a real democracy, it means that everybody is equal, everybody has a vote or a say. And that means that any calculation on how we share the resources of the world does not get based on competition. It gets agreed politically and economically on per capita basis of sharing the resources. And the big resource for climate change is that we don't put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it's an attitude of cooperation that is what is needed here. and that is what is missing. Okay, that's number 4. Number 5. It goes from 4 to 6. What's happened? Well, okay, I think it's only the numbering that's wrong. I hope so. I can just check that. I won't check it now. The result of all that, of course, is that nature has developed a tremendous diversity, and with that, a great resilience against change. It didn't survive a meteor impact 60 million years ago that wiped out 90% of species and the dinosaurs. That was, in a way, outside what I call nature. It's cosmic. If we get hit by a moon, there's nothing much we can do about it. But otherwise, nature develops in such a way that any bit we have destroyed and leave alone gradually brings back the diversity that was there. And it's us that systematically reduces all sorts of diversity, and with us, the resilience. And you see it now in both the COVID pandemic, which is rapidly spread through the world. Every one of my examples actually can have the COVID pandemic in it. You see it in the Ukraine war, where we depend on Russian oil and Ukraine wheat. If we reduce the diversity with which we operate, we are always in trouble when there is the least hang-up, and there will be lots. But it's not only diversity of nature. Humans themselves, in their evolution over these million years, have created a whole lot of races of humans, thousands and thousands of languages and cultures, and we all are very different from each other. And all of that is now being subsumed under American TV and the loss of culture that you all know about. So can we get over that? Here, one really needs a change in attitude and nothing else. We need to cherish our differences instead of doing everything we can to wipe them out in the interests of efficiency. That efficiency and resilience are opposite. They do not go together. So I think I'll go on to the next one. And this was added in a seminar I gave on this in Vienna 2 years ago, just before COVID. They said, bring in local and global. And you do need to, because that diversity that I've just been talking about depends on global barriers, mostly. Species live at home. Even the swallows that migrate, well, they have 2 homes, they migrate between them, but they live in each locally. Whereas we, and here again, the COVID pandemic comes in easily, we tend to live globally. And we fly all over the place, we communicate globally, and so on. And so that allows us to develop what Adam Smith would find horrific, the mega global corporations we have now. So I would say we need to restore local production. There have been lots of books on that. John Maynard Keynes was one of the first. He said, let things be homespun wherever possible. I want my coffee, and so I depend on the tropics for my coffee. On the other hand, nearly everything we eat is grown outside the window here. The old green thinking, act local, think global, is absolutely right. Again, the whole thing is one of attitudes and habits. Oh, here's number 5. They've got out of order, that's all. So the big issue is the one of excess. All of these things add up to us doing our lives as quickly as possible, as big as possible, as fast, as large, and so on. And we're incredibly proud of those excesses. We like everything to be bigger and better. And we've forgotten that Schumacher wrote "Small is Beautiful" and was very popular about it. But small is indeed beautiful. And the biggest, of course, the excesses happen at all scales. Little scales, like we get antibiotics. We think this is a great advance in medicine. It is fantastic advance in medicine, but it has to be used wisely. So we overuse them, a little excess. And we've got lots of bacteria that have grown resistant. So from those little things like antibiotics, we've accumulated atomic energy power that we can destroy the world many times over. And the biggest and ultimate success has also become a success, the human population itself. We can argue about that, whether it's an excess. I have no argument. I think it's a pandemic of its own. But you can argue with me, and I understand the argument. We, like any other species, try to leave as many offspring as we possibly can. And the result is growth. The growth of the economy, which goes along with that, is the symptom, but also the mechanism. And as Herman Delius said, this is growth mania. And when you add the growth of the troubles we create, the car crashes, the diseases, all the things that have to be paid for, which add to economic growth, that is hyper-growth mania. I think he's a wonderful guy. I met him first in 1984, in the middle of the growth of all these ideas. So GDP growth means we have those mega corporations, Elon Musk, Bezos, and so on, and Monsanto, who really do rule our world more than we imagine. A friend of mine, who may be in the audience, I don't know, are you here, Robin? Robin Russell-Jones has just published a book called The Gilgamesh Gene Revisited. Gilgamesh was a megalomaniac of ancient times who created the excesses that he could for himself that I've just described. We have that gene, and it creates global warming and all other problems. The only solution I see here, and I try to practice our own lives that way, is that in place of having more of everything, we look for quality instead of quantity, as indeed was in Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. It asked for quality as the fundamental thing to aim for. And one can add there that speed is one of the excesses, and slowing down would be the best and biggest way to minimize global warming. What if our lives are slower? So what? We do everything more gently and we'll be happier. So really, there is no problem in principle. The problem is only in practice if we won't do it. Come back to that in a minute. Okay, now we jump to 8 because they were out of order. And this deals with the Gaia so-called hypothesis, now theory. Absolutely crazy that when Alexander von Humboldt saw that the whole globe was connected, everything is connected to everything else, and it makes conditions for life possible on the earth. Life makes conditions for life possible. But it took Jim Lovelock a lot of argument and several books to persuade people that that is indeed how one can look at it. It's a piece of good, solid, holistic science that scientists could not stomach. They said, how can life know what's good for it? Well, I won't go into the science of that here, but we've gone on, as you know, to degrade everything. So what we have to do here is have a respect for the biosphere. After all, it invented sustainability. sustainability and sustainable development. It wasn't the Brundtland Commission, it was the biosphere. And it is the whole of the biosphere that makes life possible. You can't single out little bits. If you do the reductionist science on it, of course, you will deny that it exists. So I think that sort of teaching of what life is actually about should be part of a fundamental education of everybody everywhere. How we get there, I don't know, but it's in principle doable. And we can go back. I've made a lot of contentious arguments about what's doable. We can go back to that. What all of these 8 things add up to is the inconvenient truth that while nature operates by feedback control, which are complex and mostly negative, that if something gets out of hand, it's corrected and put back again. Nature never makes big excesses as a result. It has lots of success without the excess. We work on exactly the opposite system, that we do have feedback control of some sort, not much, but what there is positive. Our economics and our technologies feed on themselves. Economic growth that is in the news every day is an absurdity. It's completely unscientific, completely impossible to sustain, and a nonsense. John Stuart Mill talked about it in 1848. It's not that we haven't been warned. And there's been a great degrowth movement just recently, but it really started in 1848. And yet, those positive feedbacks, of course, are what has created our civilization. The Shakespeare play is a result of positive feedback that I mentioned earlier, and everything else we've done. The motor car, satellites, and this Zoom lecture is a result of positive feedback. So we have to somehow balance that positive with the negative feedback of nature. And how on earth do we do that? And that in green, I suggest the first to recognize is that negative feedback is actually the way things work and is therefore a positive boon to life. Let the negative feedbacks happen. You can come back to me and argue, but look at COVID. COVID is actually an example of positive feedback. I think COVID was created by the way we do our civilization, but we can discuss that separately. But there's an important bit of negative feedback that we do have. We create laws, and in small societies, we create customs and habits that are good for the good of all, including looking after the environment. And most of the unacculturated peoples of the world, the so-called native peoples, like in Brazil, which have been very well studied for this, most of them create a sustainable negative feedback civilization, but it isn't our sort of civilization. It doesn't enable them, after a few dramatic mistakes early on, but for the last few thousand years, to have lived sustainably. But the one beyond laws and customs and habits, which occasionally surface to keep us in control, I think we need to point out that actually we have one very good one that people don't talk about, which is that if we do all the good things we want to see done anyway to each other, and the main part of that is to give the female half of humanity equal rights to the male half, that may be a slightly unnatural thing to do, but it's a highly civilized thing to do, that women should have equal rights to men, equal pay, equal in decision-making, and so on. If you do all those things that everybody agrees would be a good thing, everybody except a few ancient religions that can't modernize, but everybody agrees that that would be a good thing anyway, the population would fall. And that creates its own problems in the transition period, of course, but those are solvable. But it's interesting that we do actually have a negative feedback that we are not much aware of. So I think that's all of those 9 habits, and I just want to look at 1 or 2 other conclusions from them all, if I can get there. Yes. So let's just say here they are, and it does look, although they were initially formulated as a description of the difference between man and nature, what they've turned out into is a guide for change, a framework that can guide us what needs to change, not to stop polluting the atmosphere, whatever it is, but to change the reasons for polluting the atmosphere. So it's cultural habits and social infrastructure that are up for rethink. And there have been a whole series of books, essentially all with the same title, The Great Rethink. Teddy Goldsmith had The Great U-Turn. Colin Tudge just now has the Big Rethink, and so on. There's several books on this. So it involves all of the arts and humanities, and therefore religion. I've called it culture/religion, but especially I picked out science and agriculture and economics. They are particular disciplines, particular approaches in which change can be easily formulated. And in science, it is that of the end or near end of the Draconian era. Francisco Sagasti, one-time chief advisor to the World Bank, has written a paper actually called The Twilight of the Draconian Era. And it does away with both Prometheus, which I started with, and Bacon, and the thinking that goes with that. It can be done. And there's a lot of background thinkers that can back this up. Alex von Humboldt, I've recently read and lectured about, is a phenomenal person. I recommend you read anything that he wrote. It's an awful lot, so you're in for a lifetime's reading. But little known is Vernadsky in Moscow. I came across a pupil of his, Nikita Moiseyev, who's written a little book about him as a result of a conference with lots of his students and colleagues. Vernadsky coined the word noosphere. The noosphere, which people think Teilhard de Chardin brought into the world. Not so. It was when Vernadsky visited Paris and met Chardin, Chardin picked it up and wrote a book about it. But Vernadsky had the ideas. There is a notion by which human intellect can join up with the biosphere and become the noosphere, a knowledgeable, understanding sphere that harmonizes with nature. Vernadsky saw that very clearly. René Dubois wrote a book called Wooing of the World, Wooing of Nature. I don't remember the title, but wooing is the same idea. We need to somehow, and he worked with Barbara Ward, who set up the Institute, International Institute for Environment and Development. There is a move that intellectually we can actually join with nature and thereby do the right things. I can't say more about this here. Each of these topics that I'm covering, science, agriculture, economics, and culture generally, really need another long paper. But just look and see what a theologian could do. The biosphere actually delivers what we ask for in the Lord's Prayer. It's amazing. The biosphere gives you your daily bread. It forgives you your trespasses up to a limit, which are described by limits to growth, and so on. All the things in the Lord's Prayer, the biosphere is vital to provide. And Pope Francis has recognized that in Laudate Si and Ask for Nature to be Hallowed. That completes the Lord's Prayer there. I think that's very important, and it's quoted in the Club of Rome's most recent book called Come On, which I highly recommend. It's a summary of all this. So I think we can say that we can do this. Big changes is what made civilization possible in the first place, and we've got there. And now we need to make further big changes, which will be just as dramatic, but nevertheless, they are, I hope I've shown, doable, and future generations, one hopes, will call it the new Enlightenment, like we call the 18th century the Enlightenment. It was the Enlightenment to get away of myths. Now we need to get away of the myth of economic growth as the main myth. So we have the means and we have the knowledge to act. We only have to do it. And the COP26 in Glasgow showed how we can't, because of lots of interests, huge enthusiasm, but there's no reason why we can't put it together and actually do it. We may not, and it's worth quoting here the fourth industrial revolution, which is not, to my mind, the Enlightenment. The fourth industrial revolution is Klaus Schwab and the Davos economic, what's it called in Davos? Economic something. Their aim is to merge man with machine. That seems to be going exactly in the opposite direction. It's extremely powerful. Elon Musk is at the peak of doing it, and people like that. If that goes on, we can be pessimistic. But if we can do something like what we describe, there's plenty of reason to be optimistic, as is Christiana Figueres, who made the Paris Climate Conference a success. We did not have a figure like that for the Glasgow one. So I think there we are. I will stop there and we'll have a discussion. So thank you.